The massive Russian strikes on Kharkiv on June 7, 2025, featuring over 40 explosions and killing at least 5 civilians, were not merely another escalation in what has become Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II. This assault represented something far more consequential: the crystallization of irreconcilable strategic objectives that render peace negotiations fundamentally impossible. The attack came as calculated retaliation for Ukraine's audacious Operation Spider's Web just days earlier, a strike that reached 4,300 kilometers from the front lines to destroy Russian nuclear-capable bombers, inflicting an estimated $7 billion worth of damage to Moscow's strategic arsenal. These dueling operations illuminate precisely why the Russia-Ukraine war, now entering its 4th year, shows no credible path toward resolution. Both sides continue to believe military victory remains achievable, creating what analysts call a mutually optimistic conflict, where negotiated settlement appears less attractive than continued fighting. The war has evolved beyond territorial dispute into an existential contest over the nature of European security, international law, and the post-Cold War global order itself. It is often said that nothing moves a politician faster than the sound of distant gunfire. But in this case, the gunfire isn't distant enough to compel either side toward accommodation. The latest round of Istanbul negotiations collapsed within days as Russia's maximalist demands collided with Ukraine's existential imperatives, leaving little room for compromise. Meanwhile, Russia advances into Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region for the first time, seizing territory roughly equivalent to half of New York State since February 2022. Moscow's strategic objectives have crystallized around complete Ukrainian subjugation, not merely territorial gains or security buffers. Putin's regime demands what it euphemistically calls the denationalization of Ukraine through systematic suppression of Ukrainian identity, culture, and language, alongside regime change in Kyiv. These goals represent an imperial project that fundamentally cannot coexist with Ukrainian sovereignty, making any negotiated settlement that preserves Ukraine as an independent state unacceptable to Moscow. The scope of Russian demands extends far beyond the currently occupied territories, which comprise 18.8% of Ukrainian land as of June 2025. Moscow insists on recognition of its illegal annexations, while simultaneously demanding Ukrainian demilitarization, neutrality, and effective Russian veto power over Ukraine's foreign policy alignment. Russian officials have explicitly stated their intention to control Ukraine's relationship with Western institutions, prevent NATO membership permanently, and maintain the right to intervene in Ukrainian domestic affairs. From Moscow's perspective, these demands represent defensive responses to decades of NATO encroachment on Russian borders, despite what the Kremlin claims were assurances that the alliance would not expand eastward. Russian leadership consistently argues that NATO's expansion from 16 members in 1999 to 32 members by 2024, bringing the alliance to Russia's doorstep through the Baltic states and now potentially Ukraine, constitutes a fundamental breach of post-Cold War understandings and an existential security threat requiring forceful correction. Russia's persistence stems from Putin's fundamental belief that this conflict represents an existential struggle to reshape the post-Cold War international system. From Moscow's perspective, accepting Ukrainian sovereignty and Western integration would validate the very liberal international order that Russia seeks to dismantle. The war has become Russia's primary vehicle for demonstrating that Western-led institutions cannot protect their partners, that economic interdependence creates exploitable vulnerabilities, and that spheres of influence remain legitimate organizing principles for international relations. This maximalist agenda explains why Russia continues fighting despite enormous costs estimated at $250 billion in direct military expenditure and $1.3 trillion in total economic impact through 2025. The Kremlin views these expenses as acceptable investments in achieving generational strategic objectives that cannot be accomplished through any other means. Recent Russian advances into Dnipropetrovsk region demonstrate Moscow's continued belief that territorial gains can force Ukrainian capitulation. Ukraine's strategic position reflects equally uncompromising but fundamentally defensive objectives centered on national survival. Ukrainian resistance stems not from territorial ambition, but from the recognition that any accommodation to Russian demands would destroy Ukraine as a sovereign state and condemn its population to systematic cultural extermination. This understanding shapes every aspect of Ukrainian strategic thinking and makes territorial concessions politically impossible. Opinion polling consistently shows 87% of Ukrainians oppose any territorial concessions to Russia, a figure that has remained stable despite massive casualties and infrastructure destruction. This reflects Ukrainian understanding that Russian occupation involves systematic deportation of children, forced re-education, suppression of Ukrainian language and culture, and installation of collaborative governance structures. The approximately 20,000 Ukrainian children forcibly transferred to Russia represent just one dimension of what Ukrainians correctly identify as genocidal policies. Ukraine's core strategic objectives, complete territorial restoration, preservation of statehood, NATO and EU integration, war crimes accountability, and ironclad security guarantees, represent the minimum requirements for Ukrainian survival as a distinct nation. These demands are not negotiating positions, but existential necessities that no Ukrainian government could abandon while retaining domestic legitimacy. The Ukrainian position has been reinforced by battlefield successes that demonstrate continued military viability despite Russian advantages in manpower and industrial capacity. Operations like the June 1st Spider's Web strikes on Russian strategic bombers showcase Ukrainian capability to threaten core Russian military assets, providing confidence that continued resistance can achieve better outcomes than negotiated surrender. Paradoxically, the war economies that have emerged in both Russia and Ukraine create powerful incentives for conflict continuation rather than resolution. Russia's transformation into a wartime economy has generated short-term economic growth and employment benefits that make peace potentially destabilizing for Putin's regime. Defense spending now consumes 37% of Russia's federal budget and represents the largest component of economic activity, creating vast constituencies with vested interests in continued military operations. Russia's defense expenditure for 2025 reaches 15.5 trillion rubles, $160 billion, representing 7.2% of GDP and the highest level since the Cold War. This massive spending has driven GDP growth of 3.6% in 2024, exceeding both American and many European economies. The military-industrial complex now employs millions of Russians and provides the primary source of technological innovation and industrial investment in the Russian economy. Simultaneously, Russia has successfully adapted to Western sanctions through trade redirection, alternative payment systems, and shadow fleet operations for energy exports. Bilateral trade with China reached $237 billion in 2023, while Russian energy revenues continue providing financial resources for military operations despite price pressures. This economic resilience reduces immediate pressure for negotiated settlement, while creating new dependencies that favor continued confrontation with the West. Ukraine's economic position creates parallel incentives for continued resistance through massive international support totaling over $158 billion from EU countries alone. The promise of $524 billion in reconstruction assistance over the next decade, coupled with accelerated EU membership prospects, offers long-term economic opportunities that dwarf any conceivable benefits from accommodation with Russia. Ukraine's economic future lies in Western integration, making continued resistance not just strategically necessary, but economically rational. The use of frozen Russian assets to provide $50 billion in loans to Ukraine exemplifies how international financial mechanisms now enable prolonged conflict without direct budgetary impact on donor countries. This arrangement allows sustained Ukrainian resistance while reducing political costs for Western governments, creating conditions where extended warfare becomes financially sustainable for all parties except Russia's depleted sovereign wealth funds. Despite enormous casualties, estimated at over 790,000 Russian and 400,000 Ukrainian military deaths and wounded, both sides retain significant military capabilities that support continued operations. Russia's successful recruitment campaigns have met 85% of assigned targets, while industrial mobilization produces 3 million artillery rounds annually, demonstrating sustained capacity for prolonged warfare. However, Western intelligence suggests Russian industrial capacity faces critical constraints by 2025 to 2026, as stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment become depleted. Ukraine's military adaptation has focused on technological innovation, particularly in drone warfare, where Ukrainian forces plan to manufacture 4.5 million FPV drones in 2025. The development of fiber-optic-controlled drones immune to electronic warfare represents genuine technological advantage over Russian capabilities. Ukrainian success in integrating Western weapons systems, from Patriot air defense to ATAK-MS missiles, provides confidence that military aid will continue enabling effective resistance. The deployment of 12,000 North Korean troops to support Russian operations demonstrates Moscow's recognition of manpower limitations while providing additional capacity for continued fighting. South Korean intelligence reports indicate 600 North Korean soldiers have been killed and 4,100 wounded, bringing total North Korean casualties to 4,700. Simultaneously, NATO's commitment to new capability targets requiring 5% of GDP defense spending indicates Western preparation for prolonged confrontation with Russia. Neither side faces immediate military collapse that would force acceptance of opponents' terms. Russia maintains advantages in manpower, industrial production, and strategic depth, while Ukraine benefits from technological superiority, defensive positioning, and continued Western support. This military equilibrium creates conditions where both sides view continued fighting as more promising than negotiated settlement on unfavorable terms. The brief resumption of direct Russia-Ukraine talks in Istanbul during May and June illuminated the fundamental incompatibility of negotiating positions that make diplomatic resolution impossible. Russian demands for territorial recognition, Ukrainian neutrality, military limitations, and sanctions removal directly contradict Ukrainian requirements for sovereignty, security guarantees, NATO membership, and territorial integrity. These positions represent zero-sum objectives where any gain for one side constitutes existential loss for the other. The Trump administration's approach has further complicated diplomatic prospects by potentially offering Russia significant concessions while pressuring Ukraine to accept territorial losses. Trump's proposed recognition of Russian control over Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, rejected by both sides, demonstrates the impossibility of finding middle ground between maximalist positions. American threats to withdraw support unless Ukraine negotiates have prompted European moves towards strategic autonomy that may reduce, rather than enhance, prospects for coordinated Western pressure on Russia. The failure of economic coercion through sanctions to modify Russian behavior has eliminated the primary Western tool for compelling Moscow toward negotiated settlement. Russia's successful sanctions adaptation, combined with continued Chinese and Indian energy purchases, provides economic resources for continued military operations while demonstrating Western inability to impose decisive costs on determined adversaries. Trust deficits created by systematic Russian violations of previous agreements, from the 1994 Budapest Memorandum to the 2015 Minsk Accords, make any future negotiated arrangement inherently unstable. Neither side believes the other would honor commitments that constrain their essential interests, making negotiated settlement appear less credible than military resolution. The collapse of prisoner exchange negotiations on June 7th, with Russian trucks carrying 1,200 Ukrainian bodies already at the border when talks broke down, exemplifies the impossibility of cooperation even on humanitarian issues. When adversaries cannot agree on returning the dead, broader political accommodation becomes inconceivable. The broader international environment reinforces rather than constrains the bilateral conflict through competing alliance structures and conflicting strategic objectives. NATO's commitment to Ukrainian eventual membership, while providing essential security guarantees, makes Russian accommodation impossible, since Moscow views NATO expansion as an existential threat, requiring prevention through any means necessary. European defense spending increases averaging 3.5% of GDP annually represent permanent militarization in response to Russian aggression, creating new industrial constituencies and strategic planning assumptions based on continued confrontation. The development of pan-European logistics systems, command structures, and defense industrial capacity assumes long-term competition with Russia rather than near-term reconciliation. China's strategic partnership with Russia, while stopping short of direct military support, provides economic lifelines and diplomatic cover that enable continued Russian resistance to Western pressure. Beijing's interest in demonstrating Western institutional weakness and promoting multipolar alternatives to American hegemony creates incentives for prolonged conflict that weakens both Russia and the West. The Global South's reluctance to condemn Russian aggression, with 2/3 of world population in non-condemning countries, reflects perception of Western double standards and provides international legitimacy for Russian positions. This fragmented global response reduces pressure on Moscow, while demonstrating limits of Western influence in enforcing international law. Russia's nuclear doctrine revisions and deployment of tactical weapons to Belarus create coercive leverage while simultaneously constraining escalation possibilities. Moscow's escalate to de-escalate strategy aims to deter Western military support for Ukraine without triggering direct confrontation that risks nuclear exchange. However, successful Ukrainian strikes on Russian nuclear-capable assets without triggering escalation demonstrate limits of nuclear coercion in achieving political objectives. The collapse of arms control architecture removes institutional constraints on competition while creating new uncertainties about escalation dynamics. Russian deployment of Oreshnik hypersonic missiles and threats of nuclear weapons represent attempts to reshape Western calculations without crossing thresholds that would trigger overwhelming retaliation. Nuclear weapons simultaneously enable and constrain both sides, providing Russia coercive leverage while limiting Western military support, yet also preventing decisive action that might resolve the conflict through force. This nuclear stalemate contributes to prolonged conventional warfare rather than either peaceful resolution or decisive military conclusion. The war has catalyzed fundamental changes in European security architecture that make return to pre-war arrangements impossible, regardless of immediate military outcomes. NATO expansion, to include Finland and Sweden, European rearmament programs, and development of alternative energy supply chains represent irreversible strategic adjustments that preclude restoration of cooperative relationships with Russia. The emergence of parallel economic systems, from alternative payment mechanisms to separate energy markets, creates new patterns of interdependence that favor continued confrontation over reintegration. Russia's successful pivot to Asian markets provides economic alternatives to Western relationships while demonstrating viability of non-Western economic alignment. European Union accelerated integration of defense planning and industrial capacity represents generational shift towards strategic autonomy that reduces rather than increases incentives for accommodation with Russia. The development of European defense industrial capacity independent of American systems creates new technological and economic relationships that assume continued separation from Russian markets. The Russia-Ukraine war persists because it represents a fundamental contest over incompatible visions of international order rather than a traditional territorial dispute amenable to negotiated division. Russia's demand for spheres of influence and right to determine neighboring countries' political alignment directly contradicts Ukrainian sovereignty and the principle of national self-determination that underlies the entire post-Cold War settlement. Both sides continue fighting because they perceive military victory as more achievable than acceptable negotiated outcomes. Russia believes it can outlast Western support through economic resilience, Chinese partnership, and superior manpower, while Ukraine counts on continued Western assistance and eventual Russian industrial degradation to 2026. The structural transformation of European security, creation of wartime economies with vested interests in continued conflict, and development of alternative international institutions all represent changes that transcend immediate military outcomes. These developments suggest the Russia-Ukraine war is not an aberrant crisis, but the opening phase of a broader confrontation between competing models of international organization. On paper, Europe possesses more than enough resources to defend itself and support Ukraine simultaneously. In 2024, the combined GDP of the European Union eclipsed $19 trillion, dwarfing Russia's $2 trillion economy. Europe's 449 million citizens outnumber Russia's 145 million, while European defense spending of $457 billion exceeds Russia's $146 billion expenditure. Yet these advantages cannot overcome the fundamental incompatibility of strategic objectives that makes this conflict essentially irreconcilable. The war will likely continue through 2026 at minimum, with potential inflection points coming from Russian industrial constraints, shifts in Western political support, or unexpected military developments. However, even military resolution would not restore pre-war arrangements given the fundamental changes already catalyzed in European defense, global economic relationships, and international institutional structures. Until Russia abandons its imperial objectives or Ukraine accepts subjugation, the war will continue as a contest between irreconcilable visions of sovereignty, security, and international order that cannot be resolved through diplomatic compromise. The absence of credible mediators, enforcement mechanisms, or mutually acceptable compromises means negotiated settlement remains implausible until one side faces imminent military collapse or fundamental domestic political transformation. Sometimes money isn't just the answer, it's the only answer preventing resolution. Both sides now have sufficient financial resources to continue fighting indefinitely, creating a grotesque equilibrium where war becomes economically sustainable, even as it remains politically irresolvable. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has become what strategists call a forever war, not because either side wants perpetual conflict, but because the stakes involved make anything less than total victory appear existentially unacceptable. Bringing you the latest in news and analysis, this has been the Ergo Report. Thanks for tuning in.